Welcome, adventurers, to the Dangers and Dragons podcast. Every week we get together and dive into some wild new world full of, epic quests and crazy characters, and of course, magic and monsters. You can't forget about those. But today, today's a little different. We're still going on an adventure, but it's like someone left us a map and a history book all at the same time. We've got this Dangers and Dragons adventure guide, which seems to be like a blueprint for how to make amazing fantasy stories, especially for this show. And alongside that is this, I don't know, this kind of eerie narrative, Requiem for Humanity.
It's definitely a curious pairing. On the one hand, you have a guide to crafting like the most engaging fantasy stories, full of heroes and magic and quests and the stuff that just draws you in. And then Requiem for Humanity, it makes you think about. Well, it makes you think about the bigger picture, like how even the most incredible civilizations, they eventually, well, they don't last forever.
Yeah, you've got a point. So let's dig into this adventure guide first. It's pretty detailed. It even talks about breaking a story down into like 8 parts, almost like 8 little movies. Each one is supposed to be, entertaining and really get people thinking. What jumps out at you about this whole structured approach to storytelling?
I think it's fascinating how intentional it is. They lay out this 3-act structure for each of these mini movies. Like the first act always starts with what they call the reluctant call to adventure, which is, come on, it's classic. Then in the second act, the heroes, they face some challenges, they come up with a plan. Of course, there's a twist, the antagonists, they're stronger than everyone thought, and it all kind of falls apart, which leads to the big showdown in Act 3. It's a structure that just works.
Right.
Why do you think that is? Why does this kind of structure work so well in stories?
I think it's all about anticipation and keeping people on the edge of their seats. The call to adventure, it draws you in right away. Then all the setbacks and challenges, they make the stakes feel real. You start to care about what happens. And of course, you have to have the big payoff, the victory at the end. They even talk about ending each like 15-minute section with a mini cliffhanger. So you just have to keep listening, You got to find out what happens next.
Absolutely. And to really make you care about the story, the characters have to be, well, they have to be interesting. They have to change and grow throughout the story. This guide says it's really important to give the protagonist, the hero, clear motivations. Like, we need to understand why they're putting themselves in danger, why they're going on this quest. We need to see how they transform, how they become different by the end of the story.
Right. And the bad guy, the antagonist, they can't just be some, mustache-twirling villain. They need some depth. The guide says to keep them mysterious, reveal their motives little by little. It's much more interesting when you don't know everything about them from the start. Plus, all the other characters, the supporting cast, they need to have their own personalities, their own quirks. It just makes the whole world feel more real.
And speaking of the world building is huge. They talk about using really vivid descriptions, really appealing to all the senses. Don't just say it's an enchanted forest. Make the listener feel the dampness, hear the leaves rustling, maybe even smell the strange magical plants and stuff. It's about making the listener feel like they're really there. How important do you think that is in a fantasy story, that level of detail, I mean?
Oh, it's crucial. It's what takes the story from, words on a page to a place you can almost visit. And they talk about introducing magic gradually. Don't just throw all the spells and creatures at the listener right away. Let them discover the magic of the world along with the protagonist.
Exactly. And when you're actually telling the story, you have to keep things engaging. They suggest, like, varying your pacing and your tone. Build suspense when you need to, speed things up during action scenes, let things slow down for those quiet, reflective moments. The dialogue, too, it can't sound forced or unnatural. It needs to sound like real people talking, and it needs to, move the story forward. And no one wants to hear characters just spitting facts at each other.
Totally. And something else they highlight is, it's emotional resonance. It's not just about what happens in the story. It's about how those events make you feel, That tension between hope and despair, the courage and fear the hero feels, that's what really connects with people.
Now let's talk about my role in all of this. The expert lore master. They suggest this lore master provides all the background information on the myths and creatures, explaining where they come from and what their powers are. But they also say, and this is interesting, they also say the lore master should inject some humor, keep things light. Why do you think it's important to have that balance between, the serious stuff and the funny stuff?
I think it helps keep the lore from feeling too dry. You can learn about a griffin or a basilisk or whatever, but then have a good laugh right afterward. It makes it more fun, more like a conversation between friends than a lecture,
Makes sense. And as we're getting closer to the end of this 8-part story, They talk about having a twist in that final episode, something totally unexpected that happens after the hero thinks they've won. What kind of impact does a twist like that have on the audience, do you think?
It can really change how you see the whole story. It makes you rethink everything that's happened. And the guide says the final victory should come from the fear that twist creates, which just makes everything even more intense. Then they suggest a short epilogue, just to show how the story changed the world. It gives you a sense of closure, but also, a little hint of what might come next.
I like that. And throughout the whole series, they keep emphasizing this idea of, fantasy world logic, but also encouraging critical thinking. It's like they want the audience to really think about what's going on, to come up with their own interpretations,
Yep.
and to, not just take everything at face value.
Right, and they get really specific in this annex section. They talk about using your voice, changing it up to keep things interesting, asking questions to build suspense, even sharing our own reactions to the story, just to make the audience feel more connected, more involved.
It's smart. They talk about painting those vivid pictures with words. Like,
Yeah.
don't just say there was a battle. Describe the clash of swords, the roar of the dragon, the screams of the... Well, you get the idea.
Yeah.
And changing the pace of the narration to match the mood of the story. Fast-paced for action. Slower for those more, thoughtful moments.
Yeah, and the dialogue, it can't just be there to fill space. It needs to feel natural. It needs to tell us something about the characters, and it needs to move the plot forward. And humor should, well, it should just come naturally, from the situation, from the characters, from what's happening in the story. It shouldn't feel forced.
They even mention us, the hosts, reacting in funny ways. Those moments where something surprising happens and we say something like, oh my gods, or whatever. And of course, a little sarcasm never hurts.
Now, we have this whole guide telling us how to create these amazing, hopeful fantasy stories. But then there's Requiem for Humanity, which is, well, it's a bit different. It's about this ancient artifact, a shard of obsidian that shows how societies collapse. And it's not just random, there seems to be a pattern. What was your first reaction to this? This is a pretty big contrast to the adventure guide.
Yeah, it's a bit unsettling. The shard doesn't just show ruins. It shows what came before the ruins, the whole process of things falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
And the narrator did some research. These weren't just made-up visions. These were real civilizations that crumbled. What's really creepy is that the focus isn't on how they collapsed, whether it was war or famine or whatever. It's on this pattern, this underlying pattern that seems to lead to, well, to their inevitable end.
And once the narrator sees this pattern, it changes how they see everything. Suddenly the things we're doing now, they don't seem so permanent. The future, that doesn't seem so bright anymore. It's like we're just repeating the mistakes of the past.
And of course, when the narrator tries to tell people, their colleagues, they don't believe it. They just see an old rock. But the narrator sees a prophecy, a warning. It just shows how hard it is to change your perspective, especially when what you're seeing challenges everything you thought you knew.
Yeah, but when the narrator tries to warn people in power, people who could actually do something, their reaction is even worse. It's not disbelief, it's fear. Because they see the pattern too. They see it in their own empires. And suddenly everyone's scrambling to make changes, but underneath it all, there's this sense of dread. Like no matter what they do, it's not going to be enough.
And in the end, the narrator is forced out. They have to retire early. And they find themselves drawn to the ruins of those past civilizations. Almost like they understand those people now. The news from the outside world, it just confirms what the shard showed. It's all happening again. But there's a strange comfort in knowing this all happened before.
And the story ends with this really powerful reflection on how to react to this knowledge. The narrator says anger is pointless. The only answer is to defy it. But not in some big grand way. In small ways. By loving fiercely, creating things, and really living, even though we know how it all ends. The artifact doesn't offer any hope, but it does give a sense of purpose. Fall beautifully, create, and laugh in the face of it all.
So with these two sources, one is a guide to creating these hopeful, adventurous stories, stories with a clear structure, a happy ending. And then the other, it's a story about how civilizations decline, how there's this pattern that always seems to repeat itself. What's the connection? Do you see one?
It really makes you think. Do we tell these stories, these heroic adventures, as a way of defying that cycle? Do these stories fulfill some basic human need? The need for hope, for agency, even if history tells a different story.
That's a great question. Maybe the Dangers and Dragons podcast is exactly that. Maybe it's a place where we choose to tell stories about good triumphing over evil, about heroes overcoming challenges. Maybe it's a small act of rebellion against the idea that everything eventually falls apart.
And think about the structure of those fantasy stories. The hero faces these impossible odds, but they keep fighting, and in the end, they win. Could that be a reflection of our own desire to believe that we can overcome any challenge? Even if it's a societal challenge, a big one.
It's like those individual stories, those little victories, they give us a glimmer of hope. They let us play out a different ending, a better one. And think about the lore master, what we talked about earlier, explaining the myths, analyzing the stories, finding the humor in it all. Maybe that's another way of coping, of finding meaning in the human experience, even if it's all going to end.
So, what stands out to you most about these two sources? Is it the process of creating a good fantasy story, or is it the bigger ideas, the idea that societies rise and fall in these cycles?
For me, it's the resilience of people. Our need to tell stories, to hear about heroes and adventures. Even if, like, history tells us everything eventually comes to an end, we still want to believe in those heroes. We still want to see good triumph. It's amazing, really.
The guide talks a lot about creating a sense of wonder, of magic. Even if Requiem for Humanity is, well, a bit pessimistic, isn't there something magical about our ability to imagine things, to create these whole worlds? Doesn't that kind of defy the idea that everything is predictable?
Definitely. That ability to dream things up, to create these amazing characters and stories, it's a special thing. And it has nothing to do with, well, with the rise and fall of empires or any of that.
And when the guide tells people to rate and follow the Dangers and Dragons podcast, to support the creation of these stories, it takes on a whole new meaning when you think about Requiem for Humanity. Maybe just listening to these stories, engaging with them, is a way of, well, of keeping the human spirit alive.
I like that. It's like by participating in these stories, we're refusing to let them die. We're adding our own voices to this ongoing human narrative.
Well, this has been quite a journey. We started by talking about how to make a good fantasy story, and now we're thinking about the entire history of civilization. And the role stories play in all of it. The adventure guide gave us this hopeful blueprint, while Requiem for Humanity made us think about, well, about the limits of human achievement. It's a lot to process.
It is, and it shows how powerful stories are. They're not just entertainment. They're a way of coping, of understanding the world, of finding meaning in, well, in everything.
So, actually, after all this talk about heroes and empires and the end of everything, I want you to think about the stories that really stick with you. Are you drawn to the ones with happy endings, or the ones that make you face the hard truths? Maybe the answer is both. Maybe we need both kinds of stories to make sense of, well, to make sense of being human. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive on the Dangers and Dragons podcast.
Yeah, but thanks for bringing these sources together. It makes you realize just how important stories are, how they shape the way we see ourselves and the world, and leaves you with a lot to think about, which is always a good thing.